Hi, everyone. I'm Kay Chalamet from the Department of Music and from African and African American Studies, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here to introduce Dr. Stephen Kaplan, who is the Gail Levin DeNoor Chair in Comparative Religion, Emeritus, and Professor of Comparative Religion and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. There is a great deal to say about Professor Kaplan, so let me begin by advising you at least partially of his local roots. His education began with a BA and an MA at Brandeis University, followed by an MTS from the Harvard Divinity School. In 1977, though, he moved to Jerusalem and in 1982 received his PhD in Religion and African Studies from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem with a dissertation on medieval Ethiopian monasticism. This became his first book, The Monastic Holy Man and the Christianization of Early Solomonic Ethiopia. Throughout his career, Professor Kaplan has contributed a wealth of new sources and insights to early studies of Ethiopia, its literature, its history, and its culture. But familiarity with Professor Kaplan's training and extraordinary contributions in medieval studies does not prepare one for the diversity of topics, multiple methodologies, or penetrating theoretical insights found in his writings. His oeuvre extends from medieval studies to the present day, moves from manuscript sources to ethnographic participant observation. He works with virtual sources. He incorporates both archival and ethnographic research in Ethiopia, Israel, and the United States, and provides insight into a range of diverse and challenging topics ranging from the Christianization of time in 15th century Ethiopia, which came out in 2014, to rotating credit associations among Ethiopian women in Israel in 2009. Dr. Kaplan has published 4 additional monographs in addition to The Monastic Holy Man, several on the Ethiopian Jews, including his landmark volume, The Beta Israel Falasha in Ethiopia, from earliest times to the 20th century. He has 8 additional edited volumes, including Indigenous Responses to Western Christianity, 2 annotated and huge bibliographies of the Ethiopian Jews. His edited volume in 2005, titled Ethiopia and the Missions, Historical and Anthropological Insights, marked his increasing engagement at the crossroads between historical and anthropological studies. Kaplan's work has also crossed into transnational studies, as seen in the volume he edited with Merav Mak on transnationalism and Christianity in the Holy Land and creating the Ethiopian diaspora, which appeared in 2011, co-edited with yours truly. An unusual aspect of Dr. Kaplan's publications are several popular books written, believe it or not, with Dr. Ruth Westheimer, including Power is the Ultimate Aphrodisiac and Grandparenthood. Stephen Kaplan is a prolific author of scholarly articles, and I often turn to these extraordinary publications, ranging from treating the Middle Ages to studies in the present. Kaplan has written about discourses of intrinsic and extrinsic racism related to the lives of Ethiopian immigrants in Israel. His forthcoming articles, How the Ethiopians Changed Their Skin, Africa, the Orient, and Their Diasporas, will appear in 2018 from Routledge. But this wealth of publications and remarkable versatility should not lead you to assume that Professor Kaplan spends all his hours writing. Indeed, he has held a series of major leadership positions at the Hebrew University, including serving as academic director of the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace. He was dean of the Faculty of the Humanities, and he was provost of the Rothberg International School. All of this in addition to chairing multiple entities, ranging from the Academic Committee, Interfaculty Program in Cultural Studies, the Institute of Asian and African Studies, and the Department of African Studies. All along the way, Dr. Kaplan managed to find time to accept a Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study Fellowship in 2007 and 2008, and he's over the years held many visiting positions, including at the University of Hamburg, at the University of North Carolina, and actually he was a visitor here at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard as well. We are privileged today to have access to Stephen Kaplan's extraordinary breadth and depth of knowledge to guide us in considering the convergence of medieval studies with African history. So please join in welcoming Stephen Kaplan, who will speak with us in search of medieval Africa, sources, methods, and traps.
Thank you very much, Kay. It's a pleasure to be here. When I hear that sort of introduction, I can't help but think President Lyndon Johnson used to often say after an introduction, that was a wonderful introduction. My father would have been proud and my mother would have believed it. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to come here, and I want to thank all of the organizers, Sean Gilsdorf, who I was in touch with about so many of the arrangements, Nicholas Watson from Medieval Studies, Professor Gates and the Hutchin Center, because it's really an opportunity for me to look back and go back to some of my roots in exploring this theme. The first article that I ever published in 1982 was entitled Hagiographies and the History of Medieval Ethiopia. And it actually drew broadly on themes that I first encountered in a course on Christian hagiography taught here at Harvard in 1977 by Giles Constable and Ihor Shevchenko. It was there that I was introduced to Peter Brown's remarkably influential article, The Rise and Function of the Holy Man in Late Antiquity, which he had published only a few years earlier. It served as an inspiration for my doctoral dissertation, which Kay mentioned, which was The Monastic Holy Man in Ethiopia, 1270 to 1527, which as a book was called The Monastic Holy Man and the Christianization of Early Solomonic Ethiopia. And what you can see is that in a fairly short period, and this is relevant to our discussions today, I went from using the term medieval to using the dates, which by the way are not the Ethiopian dates for that period, to using early Solomonic, which is a very specific term that scholars of Ethiopian studies will identify, and anyone else will be confused because they'll think I'm talking about the biblical period. So this really brings me back. Also, I must say that a great deal of my career has been based on reading articles by people who work on late antiquity or medieval Europe and saying, oh, I could write about that about Ethiopia. So I've written about the Eucharist after reading Carolyn Bynum and Miri Rubin, about the cult of the saints after once again reading Peter Brown, about Mariology, again, once again Miri Rubin, about childhood with my colleague from Haifa, Michael Goodich, ritual and society, after reading about the Corpus Christi Festival. And so a great deal of my work, or that side of my work about the history of Ethiopia, has been very much reading work which is quote unquote outside my field, but actually I would say isn't, and saying these questions are relevant to the work that I do. Now I mention this because I want to stress that I am tremendously sympathetic both to the specific tasks of exploring Africa's early history and to the more general job of placing it in perspective among other contemporaneous periods around the world. Since my talk today is the first in a series, I'm going to begin by placing the study of medieval Africa in the larger context of the writing of African history since the 1960s, consider some of the challenges this topic/period present, especially periodization, explore some of the different ways in which scholars approach the field, and talk about some of the regions. Now, I should stress that when I talk about some of these regions, that I am not an expert on all of these regions, and a lot of it comes from many years teaching a course on Introduction to Pre-Colonial Africa, which was a year-long course, and the first semester my goal was at least to teach the entire semester without talking about the contact with Europe in that way. The writing of African history has always had and continues to have a certain defensive tone about it. To this day, almost every work on the African past addressed to a general audience seems to begin by stating that Africa does have a history, and this history is important. In 1963, the Oxford historian Hugh Trevor Roper made the infamous declaration, "Perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at the present there is none. There is the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history." Lumping Africa with pre-Columbian America, Trevor Roper bemoaned the lack of, quote, purposive movement in the continent, at least by local peoples, and dismissed what took place over centuries as, quote, unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes. I stress, 1963. Trevor Roper was, of course, not the first nor the last to voice this dismissal of the African continent. Hegel's claim that Africa is no historical part of the world, it has no movement or development to exhibit, was also widely cited. Indeed, the idea that Africa did not have a history and that Africans were incapable of creating purposive movement resulted in a pernicious form of circular reasoning through which any place in Africa where there were signs of political organization or quote-unquote civilization were viewed as the result of external influences. According to the infamous Hamitic hypothesis, non-Africans, or at least non-blacks, were responsible for the spread of civilization to the African continent. Thus, Aksumite civilization was dismissed as a reflection of South Arabian civilization established on the continent by, as it turned out, the totally imaginary Habeshat people. The ancient Egyptians, whose identity remains the subject of virulent controversy to this day, were credited with imposing divine kinship as far away as West Africa. The Shirazi were viewed as Persian Muslim migrants who established the Swahili culture of the East African coast, even though Swahili is a Bantu language. The ruins of Zimbabwe were credited not to the local Shona people, but to the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, or Arab traders. And perhaps most disastrously, the Tutsi were exalted as outsiders who brought civilization to Rwanda and hence were deserving of special treatment in comparison to their majority Hutu neighbors. And we all know what the consequences of that were. Not surprisingly, therefore, much of the early work in African history in the 1960s was devoted to rescuing Africa from this racist paradigm. It is not an accident that among the names chosen for the early independent African states were Ghana, Mali, Dahomey, Uganda, and of course much later Zimbabwe. Moreover, the exploration of early states, including the Yoruba and the Ashanti, was a major focus of these early studies. In the attempt to produce a usable past, historians were interested, perhaps too interested, in writing a history which compared favorably with and resembled European history. Of course, this trend was not without its critics, and the Norwegian Africanist Finn Fugelstad, in 1992, wrote most articulately of what he called the Trevor Roper trap. There was, quote, an embarrassing insistence to pin the label state on even the tiniest polities in pre-colonial Africa. Trade, monotheism, and particularly the emergence of states became the three pillars of African history. Every organized polity became a state, but paradoxically, as a result, the vast mass of Africans living in quote-unquote tribal societies remained implicitly uncivilized. One need merely look at the third volume of the monumental Cambridge History of Africa, 1050 to 1600, to see this scholarly model at work. Now, I'm not going to read this. I'm assuming that all the people at Harvard here, to use an old joke, all the people at Harvard here can read this, and the people from MIT can have someone read it to them. But notice the number of times, notice the whole tone of this passage, which is explaining what the volume covers. Notice the number of times that in some form either Islam or Christianity are invoked, and think what percentage of the African population were Christians of Muslims in the period from 1050 to 1600. And so this really captures, and this was written, you see, Oliver, 1977, Roland Oliver, and there's a certain marvelous thing that medievalists must appreciate, that one of the great founders of African studies has a name which seems to come out of a medieval saga, Roland Oliver. But Roland Oliver, who was one of the founders of African studies, and along with his colleague Phage, edited the volume and founded the Journal of African History and really established African history in Great Britain. I mean, this is the vision that he had in this volume. This fascination with early states was not limited to the Cambridge history. If you look at a 2-volume history of West Africa, there is in these 2 volumes one article by the anthropologist Robin Horton on stateless societies. Every other article is about states. Okay? So although pre-colonial, so the fascination with early states, trade, and religious change was not, however, long-lived. Although pre-colonial Africa was in many ways the starting point for the emergence of the academic writing of African history, already by the 70s and 80s, prominent voices in the field were bemoaning the neglect of earlier periods of the continent's past. Most recently, in 2011, Richard Reed of the School of Oriental and African Studies opened his article, Past and Presentism, the Pre-Colonial and the Foreshortening of African History, by assuring his readers that, quote, reports of the death of pre-colonial African history are greatly exaggerated. It should be noted that Reed was concerned with pre-colonial history writ large, and accordingly was speaking about not only the medieval period, whatever we understand by that term, but also the 19th, 18th, and at least 17th century as well. Now, if you think about the vast amount of literature there is about the transatlantic slave trade and its abolition, the modern missionary movement, the European exploration of the continent, the West African jihads, I must confess that I've never been terribly concerned that pre-colonial history was disappearing. I think the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries get a fair amount of attention. Nevertheless, much of what Reed writes is of direct relevance to our topic today. Scholars turn more and more to colonial archives, living memories of the recent past, and the period since independence. 20th century Africa not only appeared more accessible, but also more interesting, particularly as the scholarly focus turned to social economic history, the colonial encounter, and the neglected topic of gender. Moreover, as the great hopes of early independence dimmed, scholars felt less inclined to write of past glories and historical precedents and became more interested in the colonial roots of dysfunction and disarray. As I noted a minute ago, Volume 3 of the Cambridge History covers the period from 1050 to 1600, which again we might call mid or late medieval. The previous volume begins with 500 BCE and it goes till 1050. The first volume is prehistory. In support of Reed's concerns about the foreshortening of African history, each successive volume of the Cambridge History covers a shorter and shorter period. So 3 volumes are devoted to the 105 years from 1870 to 1975, and 4 volumes are devoted to the preceding 2,370 years, and then a 5th volume, which is prehistory, which of course, is about millions, of years. Thus, there appears a clear case that African history before 1600 has been relatively neglected, and accordingly, even if we were not in a quote-unquote global moment, there would be ample reason to turn our attention to medieval Africa. We can certainly ask, as the noted historian Jacques Le Goff did in his final book, must we divide history into periods? But I think most of us would agree that as a practical matter, scholars find it helpful to locate their subject matter in both time and space. Having said this, we have to be cautious with periodization. There are several problems when we come and try and draw periods or talk about a term such as medieval. This is from one of the early, I think it's volume 2, of a journal called The Medieval Globe, which is a fairly new journal. It's written by Catherine Davis and I want to say Michael Peut, who's here at Harvard. He's a historian of China. Peut, okay. And they note the difficulty in one of the difficulties in using the term medieval, again, I'm not going to read it for you, but basically one of the difficulties in using the term medieval is that people then tend to say, okay, it's part of this sequence of ancient, medieval, modern, And the question then becomes, when are the transitions made, and why did other parts in the world make the transition to modern at different dates than Europe? And you've basically dictated the whole research agenda from the moment you've used that term medieval. Okay, so that's one of the objections that, that they raise about it. A second objection with using the term is that when we talk about of any period, and this is regardless, one of the things that we do is we need to define its coherence. And we do this by contrasting it with other periods beyond the historical boundaries on either end, and thus, rather predictably, we overlook the long-term continuities, and we emphasize what is consistent within a particular period and what differentiates it from another period. Once we assign or locate an event or institution in a specific period, we tend to highlight those aspects of its character which strengthen our periodization and ignore or downplay those features which continued relatively unchanged. So we have to be cautious about this when we do it. At the Global Middle Ages Research Network's workshop on periodization, which took place in Birmingham, England in January 2013, John Watts of Oxford cautioned that not only do terms like medieval and Renaissance not travel well, but they can lead to a search for the complementary or similar elements in the Asian, African, or whatever history it may be. Moreover, and we have to be very aware of this, even within the home disciplines, there is often a controversy as to what the periodization should be. And so the assumption that we know what we mean when we say medieval for Europe, and therefore we can argue about how we apply it to Africa, is problematic, because I'm sure the medieval here who do Europe will say, well, we're not exactly sure what it is. Certainly in the case of Africa, people are not in agreement whether we should use the term medieval and what we mean. These warnings are borne out in the periodization of African history. As in most parts of the world, there is no clear consensus among historians of Africa as to how African history should be periodized. Different regions, disciplines, and subject matters can all legitimately produce different divisions of time. It should be example noted that Oliver, who I mentioned before, who edited that third volume, had previously co-authored a volume called The African Middle Ages, or Medieval Africa. It had different titles in Europe and the United States. The periodization he originally used for this was Medieval Africa 1400 to 1800. Okay? In the revised version, it was 1250 to 1800. And he justified this comparatively late ending by saying the following: "It is therefore a very typically medieval scene which remained in place in most of Africa until the 18th century," which is a tremendously impressionistic thing, and I think would have been rather surprising to the 7.5 million Africans who by that date had been seized and exported outside of the continent. Again, this is from Oliver. I'm not going to read, but this is from the introduction to the volume. And you see, again, what are the criteria that are being used to justify a period. I mean, and note the sentence in the middle: the peoples of Africa were coalescing into tribal states rather like those of early medieval Europe. Okay? On the other hand, Christopher Ehret, who I believe was here 2 years ago responding in the first of the meetings about medieval Africa, in his textbook, The Civilization of Africa, A History to 1800, refers to the period from 350 to 1450 as the Middle Centuries. So the end of Ehret's middle period is 50 years after the beginning of Oliver's middle period. And that shows how widely different scholars can be. 1450 has, of course, become, I think, in the United States rather notorious in recent months because of the decision of the AP history people to eliminate all the earlier parts of world history and basically begin world history with 1450 and the outcry that this produced. Okay, so clearly, I mean, if we want to talk about medieval Africa or we want to use that term, whatever disagreements there are about what that term means in other parts of the world, and really in my reading about this, the one place that I found that seems to embrace that term of medieval history for their own history seems to be Japan. And there's interesting national and historical reasons why in Japan, which I'm not an expert on, but other people may be. We have to think about what period are we talking about. I noticed in some of the material from this group, I think it's 600 to 1600, but people will obviously discuss that. As I noted before, the relative dearth of research on this period, and I would say as a placeholder, we can use 600 to 1600. For any discussion of medieval Africa, there's a reason to believe that a single framework will not do justice to all areas of the continent. And again, we always have to remind people that Africa is not a country, it is a continent with very different histories. With respect to Africa, this appears to be the case particularly regarding areas such as the southern woodland savannas and equatorial rainforests, which have been associated with what are referred to as the Bantu expansions. While these regions obviously are central to any discussion of Africa between 600 and 1600, I'm not sure how they fit into attempts to discuss a global Middle Ages. If you look at recent attempts to integrate Africa into discussions of the Middle Ages or medieval history, it's not surprising that these parts of Africa receive very little attention. I looked at the past 5 conferences of medieval studies held at Leeds, and while there are only a handful of sessions on Africa, these are overwhelmingly about the Horn, Nubia, North Africa, and West Africa. Okay? Similarly, the Global Middle Ages project of the University of Texas has 2 projects, which I'll discuss more in a little while, which concern Africa. One focusing on the Indian Ocean, East Africa and the Indian Ocean, and the other partially on Ethiopia, the one about Prester John. The New Journal of Medieval Worlds makes it, in its mention of a statement of purpose, it mentions East, West, and North Africa, but not Central Africa or Southern Africa. In part, this neglect of this vast area of the continent, I mean, I assume people can in their minds fill out the rest of the continent, but this is a vast, I mean, this is an area far greater in size than the United States. Has to do with the methods that people use in working on this area. People like, who I mentioned, Eret, Jan van Sina, and others. Most historians, and I'm certainly among them, find it difficult to judge the reliability and the work that's done primarily in archaeology, but especially in historical linguistic reconstruction. All the scholars like Eret and Van Sina and others are at pains in their books to familiarize their readers with the methods. Eret, in one of his recent, in 2011, says there are 3 myths about historical linguistics. Firstly, there's a myth that any linguist can do linguistic historical work. Secondly, that language evidence is somehow more imagination than substance. And thirdly, that writing history from language evidence is mysterious and incredibly difficult. With regard to the last of these, he reassures the historian that historical linguistic method is no more difficult than statistics. I don't know about most of the people in this audience, but that is not terribly reassuring for me. So this having been said, so one of the reasons is there's a whole method being used that I think for most people who do medieval work in other parts of the globe is unfamiliar. It's not like my Ethiopia work where people say, oh, hagiography. I know what you're talking about. The other thing is it's very hard to fit the Bantu expansion into this sort of model of antiquity, medieval, early modern, modern, and those sort of elements. And we can have a discussion as what is the fate or how people would deal with those parts of Africa, which, again, are a vast part of the continent. I also have to stress at this point that the term Middle Ages or global Middle Ages is used to describe a variety of very different phenomena and research agendas. I'm not going to be able to give a complete list of these. However, it should be noticed that they often come from very different disciplines. The most common historical forays into this field involve an emphasis on regional ties and expanding our horizons beyond national or continental borders by focusing on cultural connections, interdependencies, and exchange. And this is from the University of Texas project, Early Global Connections, East Africa between Asia and Mediterranean Europe. How do you include Africa in your discussion? By arguing that there are networks that connect these areas together in terms of trade, ideas, and other such things. The other one, which of course you dealt with in 2 years ago in the first meeting that you had, is the North African Sahel Trans-Saharan connection, which once again leads very easily to then the Mediterranean basin and those sort of things. Some of the most interesting work in this respect has been done on the transmission of medieval texts. One of the best examples of this is the religious romance known as Baralam wa Yosef, or Baralam and Josaphat, which has its origins in the legend of the Buddha. There's a big interdisciplinary project on this. I think it's in Norway that it's being done. I could be wrong. Wilfred Kenfield Smith of Harvard wrote about this, as have other scholars who do global medieval work. The text originated with the Buddha legend from Central Asia. It made its way into Manichaean Pahlavi, in the 8th century into Arabic. The Arabic served as a basic not only for Islamic versions, but a Hebrew version, a Georgian version, an Armenian version. The Georgian was the basis for a Greek version. The Greek was the basis for an Arab Christian version, which was translated into Ethiopic in 1553 by the abbot of the most important monastery in Ethiopia, who himself was a convert from Islam, who had become a major monastic figure. There were also Latin, Middle English, Old French, Old Norse, Tibetan, and I have to say my personal favorite, Yiddish versions of this story. The Romance of Alexander the Great is yet another example of this sort of traveling tale. Although at first glance, and this is once again also from the Texas project, the medieval fascination with Prester John is one of these kind of projects. Although it's tempting to associate this with the Buddha legend or the Romances of Alexander, because of the multiplicity of languages and cultures in the transmission, I think that this is something which is really different. It really falls into this category of external observers projecting their desires and fears onto a foreign other. Okay? This is, that if we take the case again that I'm familiar with, Ethiopia, even after the Portuguese came to Ethiopia and wrote about the Emperor of Ethiopia and referred to him in their writings as Prester John, nobody in Ethiopia thought that the Emperor of Ethiopia was Prester John. And it never appears in Ethiopian material as a title of the emperor until the 19th century, when it's in response to people outside Ethiopia using that term. So it's not something that was transmitted and accepted in Ethiopia. It's something that people projected, again, on Ethiopia, on Mongolia, and on vast other places. Having brought up Ethiopia, and I stress most of my talk today is not about areas that I have researched, it gives me an opportunity to say a few words about medieval Ethiopia. John Iliff, in his book, The African Poor, A History, says that Christian Ethiopia's closest Christian parallel is early medieval Europe. Indeed, building off of Jack Goody's work, he notes that Ethiopia, which had the plow, intensive agriculture, literacy, and world religions, was in many ways African in geography, but not African in terms of its material culture and other culture. We'll come back to that in a second. Let me just note that one of the great topics in which there has been comparable work done in what you could talk about the global medieval is the subject of poverty and charity, where there is just today a vast literature on the Muslim world and on medieval Europe, and Iliff's book on Africa and other people on Africa. Even before the current interest in the global Middle Ages emerged, for many years, the phenomena of feudalism outside Europe garnered considerable attention. Once again, Jack Goody was one of the important scholars. To talk about this, we have studies of Ethiopia, Rwanda, Bunyoro, Buganda, and a host of other countries, both in Africa and outside of Africa, which are referred to under this rubric of feudal. Since feudalism often served as a dog whistle for medieval, or even backward, it certainly falls within the mandate of what we're discussing. However, it should be noted that the term feudal was usually being applied not only or even primary to the distant past in these countries, but to describe their 19th and 20th century land systems. It marked the social structures and economies of these and other third world countries as being ripe for transformation. Apologists for Western colonialism or development agencies claim that feudalism still survived in these countries, and therefore colonizing them was not merely subjecting them, but rather bringing these people into modern liberation. Okay, so the use, thus we can have a debate as to whether the term feudalism is useful in discussing Ethiopia or not, it should be noticed that its usage predated any serious academic study of land tenure in Ethiopia by at least a century. In fact, the term showed remarkable durability in Ethiopia because not only was it used throughout the early 20th century under the pro-Western imperial system, but it was invoked with a totally different meaning and with either greater frequency after the revolution in the 1970s by the pro-Soviet Marxist regimes. And one of my great colleagues, Tadesse Tamrat of Addis Ababa University, during that period, and I assume under a certain amount of duress since he was the head of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, wrote a paper which was called Feudalism in Heaven and on Earth, arguing that Ethiopia was feudal both in terms of its theology and in terms of its land tenure. And I can only assume that as I say, Tadesse was under a certain pressure when he wrote that. The fate of this scholarly term, feudalism, is also instructive and serves as a cautionary tale for whatever global features we may wish to discuss in the future. Beyond the implicit or explicit baggage that a term, period, or institution carries with it, when it comes into vogue, it tends to be exhaustively applied and stretched to the point of becoming almost meaningless. Think about the use of the term liminality in the 1970s. Then there's a pushback in which people note that the countless examples of things that are being labeled in this way are not actually all alike, but are quite different from each other. And then slowly the term recedes and people stop writing doctoral dissertations using the term, and a new term, global, for example, becomes the exciting term for everyone to use. In the case of Ethiopia, I also have to emphasize yet another point. Today is a golden period for the study of Ethiopian history. Although scholars of the period from 1100 to 1600, or again, whichever way we want to divide it up, are only a small minority of those who work on Ethiopia, they are far greater in number than they ever have been before. Moreover, beginning with the Ethiopian Manuscript Microfilm Library, Hill Monastic Microfilm Library, this is one of the thousands of manuscripts at that time microfilmed. I was reading, when I was preparing this, I was reading one of the numerous discussion groups or blogs or things like that, and there was a senior faculty member who said, one of my graduate students today asked me, what's microfilm? And I just wanted to go home and get in bed and make myself a cup of tea and go to sleep. But this microfilm project has, of course, today been succeeded by other projects. Now, this project had its genesis much like the project on Timbuktu, which, again, I know you heard about 2 years ago, in the fear that these manuscripts would be destroyed. In the case of Ethiopia, not by Islamic extremists, but by the Marxist regime. Thousands of manuscripts were microfilmed. The great Getachew Haile worked for years studying them and cataloging them. And then with the move to digital technology, there have been a host of other projects that are being done. Today, literally someone who's a scholar of Ethiopian language and literature could spend his or her entire life simply doing critical editions of material that hasn't been published yet and never finish. And one of the exciting things that's going on is a lot of important texts, such as the Life of Saint Lalibela, are being re-edited based on a dozen manuscripts as opposed to the single manuscript that was used for the edition that we have. So it's a very exciting period in terms of this work. In addition, for many years, archaeology in Ethiopia was focused primarily either on prehistory or on Aksumite archaeology. In recent years, there's been a lot more work done on later historical periods. And again, last year, Michael Gervers and Marie-Laure Dera were here and spoke about the work on Yimrahana Krestos, which I think is a model for the sort of work that needs to be done, where you have someone who's an expert on manuscripts and someone who's an expert on art history and someone who's an expert in archaeology and someone who's an expert on architecture working together to do this sort of work. Having said that, if there's an expression, more money, more problems, we might say more sources, more work, or perhaps more sources, more skepticism. As Dara discussed last year in her presentation, there are substantial reasons for rethinking the role of the Zagwe dynasty, and perhaps even upgrading them from Dark Ages to Renaissance, to use her terms. However, having said this, recent trends in the critical study of Ethiopian culture and history has also challenged many of our perceptions of the past. It is not clear, for example, that the church dedicated to Lalibela in the town with that name was initially built as a church, or dedicated to that Saint King until 3 centuries after his death. A similar gap exists between the time of Yimrahana Krestos and the institution of his commemoration. While I've long been a proponent of the view that the Hebraic Israelite elements in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity date to the pre-Christian leaven of Ethiopian culture, I'm increasingly doubtful about it. Much of the sacred geography of the ancient capital of Aksum, the Ethiopian Zion, dates to the period of the 15th century and the emperor Zara Yacob. Yet another biblical phenomena in Ethiopian Christianity, which appears to have emerged relatively late, is the tripartite division of churches in a manner similar to the biblical temple. Marilyn Hellman argues that this architectural form originated around 1500. And while she accepts that there was an Old Testament inspiration for this model, clearly if it emerged around 1500, it is not derived directly from an early Jewish or biblical model. Moreover, the symbol of a lion as a marker of both royalty and the tribe of Judah in Ethiopia appears to have originated with the Portuguese in the mid-16th century. Both of those symbols existed, they were combined by the Portuguese. Indeed, more generally, there appears to be little question that much of the documented practice of the Ethiopian Church, such as the devotion to the Virgin and the Cross, including their festivals, date to the middle of the 15th century. As Marilyn Hellman and Kay Shilame have been demonstrated in a recent article, the hagiographic commemoration of Saint Yared as the composer of Ethiopian church music probably dates to this period as well. We can accordingly only wonder if in comparing medieval Ethiopia of the period prior to 1400 to other cultures of a similar period, we are globalizing the Middle Ages or medievalizing later periods of history. And this is true not only for Ethiopia. There's marvelous stuff written in the line of the invention of tradition about other countries where we think things date back so long and it turns out they're much more recent. Yet another issue that arises in the case of medieval Ethiopia is that this focus has emerged almost exclusively as part of a concentration on Christian Semitic language populations. As with many aspects of Ethiopian studies from prior to the 1980s, the Oromo, and this is Oromo, the single largest group in the region, are viewed at best as an intrusion and at worst as a destructive force. Certainly, their age-generation-based system of social organization is difficult to incorporate into any discussion of the global medieval, which relies on shared elements in society, religion, and culture. Finally, let me turn to West Africa and introduce a personal note. I would be remiss if I did not mention my personal debt to Professor Nehemiah Lev-Zion. 40 years ago today, October 1st, 1978, Nehemiah began his term as Dean of Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I began my employment at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as his research assistant on a project on the ulama and politics in West Africa. Right? Again, I was doing a doctorate on Ethiopia. Nehemiah wrote or edited several volumes relevant to our concerns today, most notably Medieval West Africa, a corpus of early Arabic sources for West African history, and Ancient Ghana and Mali. The last of these remains a standard work despite the tremendous strides that have been taken in the archaeology of West Africa, and of course the archival work now being done in Timbuktu. Michael Gomez, who is going to be coming here, I think, around Thanksgiving, a little after, I guess, to talk about some of these issues. New book, African Dominion, A New History of Empire in Early and Middle West Africa, was published, I think, in January of this year. So it's hot off the presses, and one of the great opportunities I had with preparing this talk was that since I no longer prepare an introduction to African history, it gave me a reason why I had to read this book. Gomez of NYU, who is probably better known for his work on the African diaspora, has proposed a substantial revision of West African history in the regions of the trans-Saharan trade. I will leave it to the experts to determine if Gomez's rethinking does in fact result in, quote, a wholly new interpretation of West Africa's early and medieval history, facilitating its relocation from the periphery to the center of world history. Certainly, he offers radical reinterpretation of the importance of the city of Gao, the longevity of the kingdom of Ghana, the levels of meaning in the epic of Sundiata, and the global impact of rulers such as Mansa Musa of Mali and Askia Mohammed of Songhai. Moreover, by focusing issues such as the spread of slavery and the status of women, he positions himself to enter into dialogue with a wide range of historians of Africa and other regions. The case he makes for including both Mali and Songhai in any discussion of empires is certainly compelling. And I have to say, when I came into this room, the invitation to a series of lectures and saw that the topics he's talking about are precisely the ones that I thought were important in my summary of his books, I was gratified to see that I hadn't missed the point as to what the contribution was. The rethinking of medieval West Africa, however, has been taken in a substantially different direction by an archaeologist named Anne, I think it's pronounced Haour. If Gomez focuses primarily on rethinking issues in the accepted historiography of the region, and arguing for the greater inclusion of West Africa in world history, Haour seeks to compare processes in the region to contemporaneous events in the Nordic countries. Her work highlights the growing importance of archaeology in the studies of those periods of African history for which historical records are scarce. And once again, I know you had Susan McIntosh here 2 years ago. The article that she and her husband did on the city of Geno, which was assumed to be a 14th, 15th century city. And basically from their archaeology, there's a wonderful phrase, I think I'm getting it right, where they write, based on the archaeology, it is too early, too big, and too far south. That basically the city dates back perhaps a millennium more than what people thought. Revolutionizes the study of this area. And I have to say, you know, the relationship of many historians to archaeology is like the relationship sometimes to anthropology. I think, again, Peter Brown in one of his articles quotes it. He says, historians and anthropologists are like the African tribe that told the anthropologists, they are our enemies, we marry them. Okay. Certainly, when in Haour's book, which looks primarily at the Hausa, the subject of global networks does appear. it is startling to think that slaves who began their journeys in such distant corners of the globe as the medieval Sahel or Northern Europe might both have ended up being sold in the same market in 10th century Egypt. However, the core of her argument is that between 800 and 1500, both Northern Europe and the Central Sahel were undergoing similar far-reaching changes, and examining these in both venues can be mutually beneficial. One of the themes that runs through her book is that later patterns of centralization should not be read into the bureaucracies and militaries of the more distant past. Thus, while both Robin Law and Murray Last, again, I think who was here recently, stress the importance of horses, that's why I chose this picture, in the formation of centralized political organizations, Haur notes that ponies far antedate centralized polities in many parts of West Africa, and that in both Europe and Africa they were more important for raiding people than they were for fighting wars. To cite yet one more example, Haur suggests that drawing on European insights, the wanderings of African rulers such as the kings of Kanem-Bornu across the breadth of their kingdoms may not, as is commonly supposed, be due to economic or political weaknesses, but rather be connected to the symbolic and social value of such migration. Both in medieval Europe and in pre-colonial Africa, the suggestion arises that a seat of government might be defined as wherever the ruler was. And it's interesting because Ethiopia, of course, is another example in which for an extended period, the emperor was in a tent city which moved from place to place. To quote Michael McCormick in his review of her book, looking at similar questions in dissimilar but comparable societies sharpens the sense of what one cannot see directly and opens up directions beyond those entrenched in the historiography. Broad-gauged historical investigation requires perspectives beyond our fields of microscopic expertise. And the world we live in, more than just mastering the specific field, 21st century historians must acquire competence in the areas remote from the main focus. Only that transcendent competence creates the intellectual freedom to imagine different ways of writing history that one knows best. Thank you. Do I run the questions, or does someone else do?
Well, you know, you're a competent guy.
Okay. So we can have questions and just.
I can kind of scan the field.
Sure, you want to do that and oh, because people have to get the microphone and things like that.
Means that the person asking the first question will be on that side of the room. Nobody?
Well, we've solved that. I guess you can cancel the other lectures.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no?
Yes.
It's not on?
There it is. Yeah, it's on.
Well,
It's on?
green light.
It's on you.
Let me see what happens.
Okay.
If I speak loudly, maybe that will help.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah, is that better? Okay. Now I've forgotten my question.
Quite
ready.
yes.
So that's tremendously interesting and wide-ranging and just exactly all the right ways, and I'm very grateful for this. You start with in a way, a kind of negative image, a negative picture of how the word medieval might play in all of this by suggesting all the blind alleys it might lead us up, and all the blind alleys it has led us up. And in fact, in some cases, suggesting that terms drawn from the lexis of the medieval have actually been used to include all sorts of things about them. Your main example was Ethiopia and the term feudal there. So that's an admonition to the global medieval as it develops in a very interesting way. And in the process of doing that, you also point to the areas that don't yet count as medieval, on the assumption that the medieval demands some sort of contiguity, some kind of communication, some kind of similarity of methodology and that sort of thing. Although I would note that historical linguistics is a major medieval field in European studies.
Oh, okay.
It's just not done by historians, it's done by other people. So there might be other places there. But then you end with this great image of difference, where the term medieval, if it's doing any work at all, is actually about blowing up. By opening questions, by looking at areas which are contingently relatable in some sort of way, but not in direct contact with one another in some way. So, A, have I got that right? And B, is that any generalization we can draw from that? And would you want to double down on your admonition?
Well, and that's, thank you. I mean, as I said at the very beginning, and part of why I presented at the very beginning, how much of my own work has been based precisely on reading stuff by people working in other areas and saying, oh, those are interesting questions. You know, I can look at that. I'll give you just one example though about how that can work. I can't remember right now. I want to say Patrick Geary, I think is the name of the person who wrote this wonderful book about people stealing relics, right? Fruta Sacra. Okay, and you know, when I looked at the Ethiopian material, I found it surprising that there was much less of this going on, especially if you consider that the Ethiopian foundation myth of the Queen of Sheba involves the ultimate stealing of a sacred object. And so you would think that that would be a thing that says basically sacred objects are made to be stolen by the rightful. And yes, there are fights over relics and people transferring them from place to place, but it's never depicted as sort of they snuck it out, but it's given much more sort of. But that's, you know, what I guess in some ways what I'm saying is, given our experience with things like feudal or liminality or a whole series of other terms, maybe we can cut to the chase quicker here and be aware of the fact that our tendency is to take a buzzword, expand it tremendously, use it for all sorts of things, and then start moving back on it, but rather already say, well, wait a minute. If we're going to talk about a global medieval, we already need to be thinking in terms of, are we talking about these networks of relations that existed between disparate parts of the globes? Are we talking about literature which moved from place to place? Are we talking about structures that existed but may have been different in different places? And be not, you know, quite so quick to think that what we're doing is going to be this leveling out thing, you know, and again, we've already seen, you know, and again, that's why I talked about, included in the title, traps, and spoke about the Trevor Roper trap. We've already seen what happens with African history if what you do is try and say that Africa has history just the way X or Y have history. I could say more about that, but that's, you know.
Yeah. Is this thing on?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, great. I loved your talk, and it's so rich. And I have many questions, and I don't know what to ask first. On the one hand, to be able to show that different African cultures were in communication with different European cultures, virtually at every point in the history of civilization, is a major thing to be able to demonstrate, right? I mean, to be able to show that the Nile, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Congo, were highways and not buried in the Sahara. You know, they were, depending on when we're talking about, right? And it's always a shock to people that Africa was not discovered, but quote unquote, by, you know, Vasco da Gama or wherever, you know, whatever arbitrary point that you want to establish. So I like that impulse to show that Africa was in the world and the world in Africa, but simultaneously it's important to show that these were not self-contained cultures, but these cultures had to use whatever word you want. These civilizations, the word I like to use, had their own logic and rhythms and dynamic at the same time, right? Meaning, while at some point, some parts of Africa were in contact with Europe, at other points in Africa, African civilizations weren't, even simultaneously. So what I'm asking in a laborious way is, how can we account for both to tell a rich history of Africa's relationship to the world and the world's relationship to Africa? You know, in a way, it's important that we understand when the churches in Lalibela were actually carved. But whether it was the 16th century or the 12th century is less important. I mean, it's utmost important than the fact that this is like an architectural miracle, right? So that what we have to correct it, but keep the sense of wonder about the fact that these things exist. So that's sort of related to it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. But there are a number of different issues here. When we say in communication, I mean it has to often be clear that the example I used towards the end, that slaves from Scandinavia and from West Africa could have both ended up in Cairo. Yeah. But we shouldn't think that in either of those cases, those slaves were being traded from Scandinavia to buyers in Cairo, or from the Sahel to buyers in Cairo. It's that there were these networks, and I often think that as historians, we don't take seriously enough a lot of the work social scientists have done on what do we mean when we say network. We use it as a very, rough thing. That's one of the things. The other thing is, and then I mentioned the work by the Macintosh, because, one of the very remarkable things about their work is that it undermines the entire narrative that the trans-Saharan trade was what produced these cultures in West Africa. And one of the things, if I mention Nehemiah, one of the things that he was such a model about is the first thing he did when he read the work of the Macintoshes was start trying to figure out, how can I bring these people to Jerusalem for a month so we can sit down and talk about their archaeology and my Arabic sources and what's going on between them, not to start arguing about, well, I have questions about your dating, or I have questions about the way the dig was carried out, or not seeing it as an opportunity to broaden it, rather than as a threat to the work that had been done. So if you take the case of Lalibela, stage one, Lalibela or Zimbabwe or whichever one he was, were built by local African people. And let's get off the board these ideas that foreigners were brought in and built this stuff because Africans were not capable of doing this stuff. When they did it and why at a certain period, and that's another discussion, but I would agree with you. The first thing, is to celebrate these tremendous achievements. It doesn't matter with Lalibela, if Michael Jervis thinks that that many of these churches may have been built after the Zagwe dynasty, which is associated and was no longer in power. That's another discussion of a different type. Although again, you need to be careful in doing your comparisons. I mean, some of what I was saying there at the end, and I want to make this clear, it's not that we need to avoid doing bad history, which is obvious. But it's also that one of the challenges here, the minute we try and be global about it, and this is why I compared it to the thing with the anthropologist, is there's almost always this lag time between when you become aware of what people in other fields are doing. And certainly when I was teaching the introduction to African history, I was always, terrified that I was going to get up and teach something and somebody was going to say, but Professor so-and-so in their course on this told us that they no longer think that that's what happened. But,
Well, I filmed the Macintoshes at Jenny Geno in 1997. I don't think that they're still doing research together. the Macintoshes. But
Yeah, I saw only she was invited. I figured I wasn't going to, I mean, that's not.
yeah. That's over. But I had the pleasure of being there, and watching them on that dig, and that was an extraordinary thing that they discovered. Or we had Charles Bonnet last year, and Bonnet has uncovered what he calls the Nubians, sort of Nubians, and then they're black people, right? Where we would say they're all black, but projecting our own definitions. But a whole different city in Nubia, which is clearly quote unquote African, meaning black African, meaning sub-Saharan, Central Africa, et cetera, as opposed to Nilotic and Egyptian-oriented, et cetera. Being able to communicate these discoveries and to share like an interactive timeline of new facts is something that I'm trying to pursue with John Thornton and Linda Haywood, who, by the way, I just emailed to say, where are you? And Linda spent the last week in the hospital, at Mount Auburn Hospital. But she's all right now, and they send their apologies. But because there's not enough knowledge across languages and disciplines. I was making a joke with Kofi Apentang, who is the president of the Africa America Institute, that if we put, I went to, when Obama invited the African presidents, I took Larry Bobo and we went down for that dinner. And it occurred to me that if Obama put $1 million or $1 billion on the lectern and asked any of the African presidents if they could answer 5 questions about African history, not related to their own country, you'd take the $1 billion home. That's true for everybody. There are no African history classes on the African continent in high school that transcend Nigerian history or Ghanaian history, et cetera. And in the university, it's extraordinarily difficult for a student at Ife to learn about the history of Ghana or Nubia or the Swahili or something. There's a lot of narrow nationalism.
Well, and there's also, we were talking about at the beginning about this, foreshortening of African history. Look, most of the Ethiopians who study at universities in Ethiopia about Ethiopia are not specifically interested in ancient Ethiopia. I mean, there are not, there are a lot of them, but compare, but this is, again, in many ways, I often say one of the advantages that I had for many years was that I taught in a relatively small department, and therefore the expectation was that you did a lot of generalist teaching. My colleagues at Hebrew University in Jewish Studies, first of all, there's no such thing as a Jewish Studies department at Hebrew University. There are 11 of them. And if you're asked to, if you're a specialist on the prophetic books and they ask you to teach a course, on biblical poetry, that, it's viewed as compromising your academic, work. But if you're an African, well, somebody has to teach an introductory course, and that's true if you're doing Asia, or if there had been 25 other people doing Africa, I could have said, well, I only teach about Ethiopia.
Well, my question after all that, final question, is could you share with the audience not familiar with your work, your theory about the origin of the Jews in Ethiopia, the Beta Israel, the so-called Falasha, particularly in light of recent studies of DNA and compared with linguistic studies, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay, well, where to start with that? Okay, let me put it there because I think it places it well. In a very ironic way, at precisely the time that the Jewish world and the Israeli government started bringing Ethiopians out of Ethiopia and bringing them to Israel on the basis that these are people who are part of an ancient lost tribe who need to be brought home, there were scholars doing work who were placing them more clearly than ever before in the context of Ethiopia. I mean, and Kay, was writing in 77, you did your dissertation? Yeah. Kay, literally the first organized airlift of Ethiopian Jews to Israel was 1977, and Kay is writing a dissertation that the liturgy of Ethiopian Jews is based on the monastic liturgy of the Ethiopian Church. And there's a scholar named James Quirin who's at the University of Minnesota and is doing oral traditions, and he's coming to the conclusion that their position in Ethiopian society as a crafts community is the result of events that took place also 500 or 600 years ago. And shortly after that, I wrote my dissertation about monks in medieval Ethiopian society. I had no specific interest in Ethiopian Jews other than they were one of the groups that had monks, which was sort of strange. And then when they started bringing them to Israel, my colleagues, including Nehemiah Lev Zion, said, people who know about Ethiopia need to be working on this. You can't leave it to all these people who are couldn't find Ethiopia on a map of Africa, who are suddenly going to claim that they're experts about Ethiopian Jews. And so I began also reading a lot of the stuff. And in 1992, I published a book, that Kay mentioned, which I argued, this is a community through a process of ethnogenesis which formed in Ethiopia sometime between the 14th and 16th century. One of the marvelous things about that, and of course, and in Israel, there was and also among the Jewish community in the States, there was a big uproar about this. When I would say this to Africanists, this is a community which, through a process of ethnogenesis, defined themselves as a separate community between the 14th and 16th century. Their reaction was almost always, so early? Because they were thinking about all the cases in which these processes took place under colonialism. Former colleague Leroy Vale was here at Harvard, right? At one point, and edited a book, The Creation of Tribalism in Southern Africa, which is about how these tribal identities emerged, but he's talking mainly about 18th, 19th, 20th century. So people's reaction, but the dominant view of people in Ethiopian studies, that Ethiopian Jews are an Ethiopian ethnic group which emerged 400 or 500 years ago, which I always stress, when I speak about that, which has, to my mind, no relevance to whether they have a right to come to Israel or don't have a right to come to Israel. 500 years is a pretty long period to identify yourself, as being part of any sort of group.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. And so I have a couple of questions, and I would say I tend to be more positive. I would simply say at the outset that I think there's a huge lacuna in terms of scholarship and people and engagement with this, and I think that the potentials here are simply enormous. But I think we have to, much like you said, sort of on the one hand, think constructively about terminology and broadening our approach, and secondarily look at specifics of not only means of transition but also specific technologies. So, I would simply say that in terms of, let's say, a word such as medieval, it works, it's viable, and if we don't use something like that, then we're stuck with assuming that Africa is simply so disparate in context and identity that one really should not be engaging with it in a broader global discussion. And I would bring that around something that happened with a project I'm working on with a preeminent historian, and at the outset we were really enthusiastic and then simply gave up because we could not agree on terms. Like, I wanted to use king, and he wanted to use big man, and I wanted to use state, and he wanted to use something else. And at a certain point, we realized that just at the outset, he felt that these were terms that were superimposed on Africa, and I felt that if we didn't engage these terms, they're equally superimposed on many parts of Europe, that we wouldn't be able to actually address the core issues. So at a certain point, we do have real dates through archaeology and other means, and as long as we have a kind of elastic sense of temporality and spatiality, I think we can be in conversation about this. And I would also say that in some ways, I think the impact on places such as Andalusia, on Sicily, on Italy, and elsewhere are remarkably striking. And those can be tracked not only through shared practices, but also through specific technologies of building, for example, or textile making. And I think that what we have is an incredibly viable time through Google and other means of finding these kinds of connections and networks, social institutions and other things. And my experience at present is that in this period, Africa is actually a full century ahead of Europe in many respects. And so I think that in looking at what is happening in Africa, and to some degree, I think Europe is cognizant of it. They were really interested in what was happening in places such as Mali and even in the Coptic area, that it really is a terrific moment to rethink and reshape a lot of this, granted by co-joining people's disciplines. I was struck, I really loved Gomez's book as well. He pushed the boundaries in ways I didn't agree with 100%, but I thought it was so great to have that done. I think Kanye's work is also really interesting, and I think it's a really great moment where people are rethinking these ideas in a provocative way, even as it becomes politically more difficult in so many places to actually do the work, such as Mali.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, and again, at the beginning, I kind of stressed how much work I've done in this because I knew that what was going to come out in some ways was all of my, skepticism about it. But the skepticism is there, again, part of it is where I am in my career and sort of looking back. And, one of the things that when I talk about this rethinking about a lot of Ethiopian stuff, in about 2 weeks I'm going to Israel and giving a lecture. And some of it is going to basically be, what do you do when you realize that vast amounts of stuff that you published, are in need of tremendous revision? And there's no reason why after 30 or 40 years that shouldn't be the case. But it's funny to you when people will quote you back to yourself things that you no longer necessarily agree with. In terms of the terminology thing, look at Gomez in his book, and I didn't read this, but he says, I do not mean to suggest that the West African history conforms to European or Asian periodization. Rather, early and medieval effectively represent watershed developments in the regions themselves. I always would tell my students there's one footnote you have to put in every thing that you write, and it's the first thing after you can almost do it before you decide what exactly you're writing about, and that's the limits of this paper, chapter, whatever, make it impossible for me to discuss the following topics. Because anything you write, at some point you're going to say, these are the things I'm not going to discuss. Almost everything I've written, there's a boilerplate about Ethiopian Jews, there's a boilerplate thing in there about terminology. Am I calling them Falasha? Am I calling them Beit Israel? Am I calling them Ethiopian Jews? Am I calling them Ethiopian Israelis? What do I mean when I use that term? Obviously, for things like ancient and medieval or early modern or whatever it is, the way that this practically gets dealt with is you say someplace, this is how I'm using this term. This is the definition that I'm using of this term. I do not mean to imply that what I'm describing is the same as X, Y, and Z. I'm using it for a specific period. Because, again, go back to what I said. If I say to someone early Solomonic in Ethiopia, 99.9% of people will have no idea what I'm talking about. But if I say medieval Ethiopia, well, then they'll sort of say, well, what do you exactly mean? And if I say I'm talking about between this date and this date, okay, well, then they feel. But again, the terminology thing to me is it's something we need to, in a sense, get out of the way. But we also have to realize that even if we don't do the terminological thing, simply by defining things as periods, there are certain things that we are doing to the material. Again, when I would teach, my student, there's a wonderful article that a scholar wrote, again, probably in the 1960s, about the treaties that African rulers signed with European powers. And, one of the things that everyone sort of says is, like, why were they signing these treaties? The Europeans were signing them so they could use them with other Europeans. Nobody cared about the Africans. Why were the Africans signing? And I always say to my students, one of the things you have to remember, none of these people had ever heard about the colonial period. So to talk about pre-colonial Africa immediately creates something that nobody in that period viewed that as pre-colonial Africa, just as nobody viewed something as medieval, whatever. And we just have to be aware of what that labeling can do, because we can get careless about it. That's all. In terms of should we be studying, this sort of material. Look, I come from a university where, and Kay was on a visiting committee in the humanities. I would say in the humanities at Hebrew University, there is a very clear anti-modern bias. One of the senior colleagues in Middle Eastern Studies was famous for saying, anything that you write about any period after 1500 is basically journalism. Okay, so I'm not born, but raised in a thing where the most serious work is this early work.
And what does early Solomonic mean to the Yoruba culture?
No,
know what I
obviously.
mean? So
Obviously.
that's another problem. I mean, within Africa, how do you get African cultures, as it were, to speak to each other historically? What nomenclature works for that?
Right. And again, for that, you have to be careful about, I didn't mention that this same Norwegian scholar that I mentioned who wrote the Trevor Roper Trap did 2 articles where he also did comparisons between Scandinavia and Africa. But one of the things that's troubling in what he did is he used these very broad sort of terms like sacred kingship and, divine rulers, which are so broad, and it makes it possible for you to compare the Yoruba rulers with the Ethiopian rulers and with the Scandinavian rulers, but you're actually missing out a tremendous difference that there was between what the political legitimacy was of these people.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. We have a reception here, which we invite you to attend and to continue the conversation. Thank you very much, Mr. Kaplan.
Thank you. Well,